Dahlia, let me begin with you as a Supreme Court watcher up close. The Biden pace is already faster than the Trump pace, which was disturbingly fast for people who care about qualified federal judges. But what we don't know is when Joe Biden might get a chance to fill a Supreme Court vacancy.
There's been a lot of pressure, Lawrence, on Justice Stephen Breyer, who's 82, to step down, not today, yesterday, last week in January, to give up his seat. I think there's a sense that we've all learned a lesson after Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who probably could have stepped down when the Republicans didn't control the Senate and might have sort of led to a different turn of events in history. And so there's a tremendous amount of anxiety that Justice Stephen Breyer, who's 82, not make the same mistake.
And Professor Harris, nothing prevents a president from having private conversations with a justice about this. Barack Obama had a conversation that was around this topic with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Do you suspect that the president is thinking about when Justice Breyer might hand him that seat?
He's absolutely thinking about it. I mean, I think a lot of people are thinking about it. But, hopefully, when he has this opportunity, he continues to think about the promise that he made during the debate and the broader implications of potentially having a Black woman on the Supreme Court. What we've seen in research, at least in political science, is that, everybody's talking about, for example, racial diversity, gender diversity in the federal courts. And these things matter. They matter beyond the difference any one individual judge can make. They matter because these types of nominations change the context on the courts. We behave differently when we have new sets of colleagues. And so having a Black woman on the court can potentially change how on the Supreme Court, can change how other justices behave on the court. And her appointment now, or 3 Black women being appointed to the Courts of Appeals, is going to affect not just the cases they're on, but the cases that their colleagues hear, for example. Or it's not just about their votes on any one case, but their votes and their presence on a panel can affect how their colleagues on a panel decide in cases and how they vote in cases. So there's really broad implications of these nominees beyond sort of just any individual case that they might hear or just any individual vote that they might make on a case.
So, Dahlia, if we look at Judge Jackson's elevation to the appeals court, which will take a couple of months for her to get through the confirmation process, you would want her to serve a few months at least on the circuit before a Supreme Court nomination. So if there is a grand plan here that we're seeing the outlines of, it would seem that there wouldn't be a Biden nomination to the Supreme Court until the end of this year.
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I think that there is a very, very strong impetus, as Professor Harris says, to put a woman onto the D.C. Circuit, which is universally seen as a launch pad to the Supreme Court. But that's by no means the only route. There's a justice on the California Supreme Court, Leondra Kruger, who's also seen as a serious candidate for a Supreme Court seat. So I don't think that this is a chess game that requires this one person to serve for a certain amount of time and then be elevated. I think there's a lot of possible routes to this. I do think that it's clear that Joe Biden is signaling with this tranche of judges today that he is very, very serious about having women and minorities represented on the courts after 4 years of Donald Trump judges who were overwhelmingly white men. I think his point is he wants the lower courts to look like America. That is in and of itself the goal. Whatever happens next at the Supreme Court, yes, it turns on Justice Breyer, but I think the point is he's sending out a signal, a clarion signal, that this is what he values.
And Professor Harris, the Republicans in the Senate will want to make these confirmations as difficult as possible and try to slow them down as long as possible, especially when they see potential candidates for the United States Supreme Court in this group.
Yes, absolutely, they will. And, this is definitely a signal that the current president wants to take the courts in a different direction, but it's not just in terms of diversity of these judges' characteristics. It's also about diversity of their backgrounds, which their professional backgrounds, which is absolutely making a signal and something that we might expect Republicans to also push back against. For example, we have, I think it's 2 of the nominees to the Courts of Appeals have backgrounds as public defenders, right? So this is not as common the higher up we get in the federal courts. And so this is definitely a signal that Biden is trying to sort of potentially swing things back toward the left.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.